Ever realize that the ache of being abandoned can light up the same spots in your brain as actual physical pain? It's a wound that slices deeper than you can imagine, a silent scream that can haunt you for years, maybe even a lifetime. Picture this, feeling like a ghost in your own story, a boat without an anchor, just drifting in a huge gray ocean of sadness. That was Elara's reality. For so long she lived under this dark cloud, convinced she was cursed by abandonment. But what if a curse like that could actually be broken? What if the deepest hurts could somehow become the foundation for incredible strength? This is Elara's story, how she went from the crushing feeling of being left behind to the incredible lightness of taking her power back. Elara's earliest memories always had this shaky feeling to them, like she just knew, without anyone saying it, that love wasn't a sure thing, that people didn't always stick around. As a kid, she got way too good at reading a room, a clenched jaw here, a look away there, clues that someone might be about to leave. Her normal was like walking on quicksand. The first big crack in her world happened when she was only 8. Her dad, the man she looked up to with all the pure, simple love a kid can have, just walked out. No big fight, no dramatic scene she could replay in her head. Just a door closing softly, an empty chair at dinner that stayed empty, and a silence in the house that got louder every single day. Her mom, who was already struggling, just kind of disappeared into herself, leaving Elara to figure out all the confusing feelings of grief and loss, mostly on her own. That first abandonment wasn't just a one-time thing. It became the way she saw every relationship after that. It was the start of what she later called her curse. She carried this wound around, sometimes hidden, sometimes feeling fresh and raw, all through her teens and into adulthood. It wasn't just missing a person. It was missing feeling safe, feeling chosen, feeling like she was worth staying for. To little Elara, the world seemed like a place where the people you loved could just vanish, making you wonder what was so wrong with you that they wouldn't stay. This idea of being cursed wasn't some big dramatic thing when she was young. It was this quiet, sneaky belief that settled deep down inside her. It would whisper to her when things were good, "Don't get too comfy, this won't last." It would scream at her when there was any conflict, "See, you're too much, they'll always leave." This deep-seated belief that she was doomed to be abandoned, that she just wasn't lovable, became the quiet blueprint for her life. She was always watching from the sidelines, scared to really connect with anyone because she was so afraid of the loss she felt was sure to follow. The wound of abandonment wasn't just a scar. It was actively shaping her life, her choices, her fears, and that deep, aching loneliness she felt even when she was around people. That was her ordinary, painful world, before she even knew life could be any different. That constant sense of loss from being left so early started to show up as a quiet buzz of anxiety and a tendency towards feeling down, even if she didn't have the words for it back then. This curse of abandonment wasn't something that just sat there quietly. It was an active troublemaker, messing with every part of Elara's life, stealing her peace and wrecking her chances at happiness. When it came to romance, it showed up as this desperate neediness, a constant craving for reassurance that, ironically, often pushed partners away. And that just proved her deepest fear right. She was going to be left. She'd get super attached, super fast, showering new partners with love and attention, but underneath it all was this frantic worry. A text message that took a little too long to arrive, a slight change in tone, a partner needing some space. She saw all of it as a bad omen, a sign they were about to leave. The fear of being abandoned again kept making it happen. Friendships weren't much easier. Elara really struggled with trust. She'd keep people at a distance, a careful, measured space. If she didn't let them get too close, they couldn't hurt her when they left, because in her head it was always when, not if. This usually left her feeling pretty alone, like she was watching connections happen from behind a wall she'd built herself. Sometimes, to beat them to the punch, she'd unconsciously push people away, rejecting them before they could reject her. It was a defense mechanism, sure, but it only made her feel more isolated. At work, this inner turmoil turned into crippling self-doubt. and this non-stop drive for perfection. She felt like she had to be irreplaceable, absolutely flawless, so she wouldn't be tossed aside or ignored. This just led to burnout and a constant, low hum of stress that was always there. She had a hard time managing her emotions, especially if she thought someone was criticizing her, which she usually took as proof that she wasn't good enough. Low self-confidence was always with her, even when she was achieving things. The curse made her a people-pleaser to the extreme. She'd ignore her own needs, keep her opinions to herself, and twist herself into whatever shape she thought would make others stay. But always abandoning herself like that just left her feeling more hollow, and it reinforced that belief that the real her wasn't worth loving or keeping. The day-to-day reality of all this was exhausting. It was a constant fight against her own thoughts, a constant fear that everything could fall apart at any second. Life felt less like something to be enjoyed and more like walking a tightrope over a giant pit of despair, with the winds of her past always trying to knock her off balance. She often felt like she was on high alert, always looking for signs of rejection or someone about to leave. This internal chaos was the steep price of her unhealed wounds, a daily struggle that made real peace and happiness feel like an impossible dream. The lasting effects of past neglect made it hard for her to manage her emotions and keep up any enthusiasm for things she might have once enjoyed. Years went by with Elara stuck in this restless, unhappy state. On the outside, she had a life that looked okay. A decent job, a few friends, a string of relationships that always fell apart. But underneath it all, the curse was just getting tighter. The thing that finally pushed her wasn't one big dramatic event, but more like a slow, crushing pile-up of pain that finally got to be too much to bear. It was after a particularly rough breakup, a relationship she'd poured everything into, where she'd tried harder than ever to be enough, that something inside her just snapped. This partner leaving wasn't just another loss. It felt like the ultimate proof of every bad thing she believed about herself. There she was, in her late 20s, looking at the emotional train wreck of her life, and the despair was overwhelming. It felt like hitting rock bottom, a place so dark and empty that the familiar ache of her curse turned into this sharp, unbearable agony. She remembers sitting alone in her apartment, the silence feeling like a physical weight pressing down on her. The thought that just kept replaying was, I can't do this anymore. I cannot live like this for another 30, 40, 50 years. It wasn't just a passing sad mood. It was this deep soul-level exhaustion, a realization that the way she was living wasn't really living. It was barely surviving. In that moment of feeling completely broken, a tiny, unexpected spark lit up. It wasn't hope, not right away, but a flicker of something else. Defiance. A refusal to let this be her whole story. The pain had gotten so huge that, weirdly, it made a little bit of space for a new thought. What if this isn't a curse? What if this is something I can change? That question, so small and fragile, was the first whisper of her call to do something different. It wasn't some heroic leap into the unknown. It was a desperate, shaky step. She realized that if she kept going down the same path, her spirit would just be crushed. The fear of staying the same finally got bigger than the fear of the unknown, bigger than the fear of facing those wounds that had defined her for so long. This was her enough is enough moment. She didn't know how or what it would take, but she made a conscious, even if terrified, decision. She had to find another way. She had to try and heal. This was the beginning of her journey, not running away from pain, but going through it, towards a life she couldn't even imagine yet, but desperately wanted. The choice to change, to really choose herself for the first time, was the key that started to unlock the path to healing her abandonment wounds. Deciding to heal was one thing, actually doing it was a whole other story. Elara's first steps were shaky, filled with this huge sense of being overwhelmed, and this almost magnetic pull back to the familiar misery she knew so well. This was her refusing the call, or really just a deep resistance born out of fear. The idea of purposely digging into wounds that had hurt her so much felt totally wrong, absolutely terrifying. What if she opened Pandora's box and couldn't get it closed? What if she found out she really was broken beyond repair? Her first challenge was just admitting how deep her pain went without letting it swallow her whole. She started by reading articles online, cautiously searching for things like fear of abandonment and childhood trauma. Every word she read that hit home felt like both a relief and a fresh stab of pain. It was one thing to feel cursed. It was another to see her experiences laid out, analyzed, and explained in psychological terms. She thought about therapy, but the idea of telling her deepest insecurities to a stranger was paralyzing. What if they just confirmed her worst fears? What if they too eventually abandoned her by saying she was a hopeless case? This internal fight went on for weeks. She'd make an appointment, then cancel it. She'd pick up the phone, then put it right back down. This back and forth was exhausting. Her mentor didn't show up as some wise old figure, but more through a series of small, helpful encounters. One was a book she found in a used bookstore, a memoir by someone who'd gone through a similar healing journey from early trauma. Reading another person's story, seeing her own messy emotions mirrored in their words, made her feel, for the very first time, a little less alone. It wasn't a magic fix, but it was a glimmer of light. Another mentor was an online support group she kind of hid in for months before finally typing out her first shy message. To share even a tiny piece of her story and get not judgment, but understanding and kindness from strangers was a huge eye-opener. It started to crack the shell of isolation she'd built around herself. These were people who got it, who understood the unspoken language of her kind of suffering. These small interactions gave her the courage to face her biggest trial yet, actually committing to therapy. She finally found a therapist who specialized in trauma and attachment issues. Those first few sessions were brutal. Elara would sit there, tense and guarded, sometimes struggling to even speak, tears welling up as she talked about memories and feelings she'd pushed down for years. There were times she wanted to run, to go back to the painful comfort of her familiar suffering. The therapist, patient and kind, became a crucial guide, helping Elara understand that these feelings were normal, that healing isn't a straight line, and that her pain was real and valid. This therapist didn't offer quick fixes, but gave her a safe place to start the slow, hard work of untangling the roots of her curse. This was the real start of her journey, marked not by big declarations, but by the quiet bravery of showing up, week after week, to face the ghosts of her past. The challenges were many, facing painful memories, sitting with uncomfortable emotions, and fighting the urge to fall back into old habits. But with each small step, the path forward, though still scary, became a little clearer. For Elara, the inmost cave was the raw, unfiltered center of her abandonment wound. It was where her deepest fears, most painful memories, and strongest negative beliefs lived. Getting close to it was the toughest part of her journey, a challenge that would push her in ways she couldn't have predicted. This stage of her healing was all about carefully, and often painfully, taking apart her curse piece by piece. With her therapist's steady help, Elara started to acknowledge and really feel the full range of her emotions. For so long, she'd either bottled them up or been completely swamped by them. Now she was learning to sit with sadness, anger, fear, and grief without judging herself. This was incredibly hard. Anger especially was an emotion she'd always thought of as bad or dangerous. Letting herself feel the rage connected to her past abandonments, anger at her father for leaving, anger at her mother for not being there emotionally, anger at partners who'd walked away, was terrifying at first. But ultimately, it was freeing. It was like taking the cap off a bottle that had been shaken up for decades. Journaling became a huge help. Her therapist encouraged her to write letters she'd never send, to her father, to her younger self, to the parts of her that felt broken. Pouring her unprocessed grief and anger onto the page helped her get the pain outside of herself, to see it more clearly, instead of having it just churn endlessly inside. She started to see how that first abandonment had sent ripples through her whole life, affecting how she saw herself, her choices in relationships, and her view of the world. It was like connecting scattered dots to finally see a picture she hadn't fully recognized before. One of the toughest ordeals was revisiting specific memories of being abandoned. Not to relive the trauma, but to reprocess them with her adult understanding and her therapist's support. She remembered that hollow feeling in her chest as a kid, waiting by the window for a father who never showed up. She recalled the sting of being the last one picked for teams at school, something that seemed small, but her abandonment-sensitive mind had blown up into proof she wasn't good enough. She explored the sharp pain of her first adult heartbreak, where the fear of history repeating itself had been so strong. Through all this digging, she started to become more aware of her emotional triggers. She began to notice the specific situations, words, or even tones of voice that would send her spiraling back into old patterns of fear and anxiety. For instance, a partner needing a night alone, which before would have set off intense panic and accusations, she could now pause and see as a trigger, not necessarily a sign that abandonment was about to happen. It didn't mean the fear just disappeared, but that awareness created a vital pause between the trigger and her reaction. This part of the journey wasn't about quick fixes or easy answers. It was about deep, often uncomfortable digging. It was about facing the shattering realization of how much abandonment had affected her, that initial ouch phase that author Susan Anderson talks about in the stages of abandonment recovery. Elara learned that healing meant she had to feel the pain she'd been running from her whole life. There were days she left therapy feeling completely drained, like she'd run a marathon. There were moments of intense despair when that old belief that she was cursed would come roaring back. But slowly, carefully, by shining a light into the darkest corners of her inner world, the grip of that curse started to loosen. She was learning to be present with her own pain, to meet her younger, wounded self with the kindness she'd always wanted from others. This was the beginning of her true transformation, forged in the fire of facing her deepest challenges. As Elara went deeper into her healing, the focus started to shift. It wasn't just about digging up the past anymore. It was about actively reshaping her present and her future. This next phase of her core transformation was all about intentionally building new ways of thinking, feeling, and acting, specifically targeting those negative beliefs and coping habits that had been ingrained by years of abandonment. A huge part of this period was practicing self-compassion. Elara had always been her own toughest critic. The voice in her head was relentless, quick to point out her flaws and predict her failures. Learning to treat herself with kindness and patience, especially when she messed up or felt vulnerable, was a radical change. Her therapist introduced her to mindfulness exercises and meditations focused on self-compassion. At first, these practices felt weird, almost selfish. Saying kind things to herself felt like lying. But she kept at it, and slowly, she started to internalize a gentler inner voice. When old fears flared up, instead of beating herself up for still feeling this way, she learned to acknowledge the feeling with a sense of, "This is hard right now, and that's okay. I'm here for you." This was a game changer. She was learning to be her own safe place. Along with self-compassion came real self-care. This wasn't just about bubble baths and face masks, though those were nice too. It was about fundamentally putting her well-being first. This meant getting into consistent routines for eating and sleeping, which her anxiety had often messed up. It meant doing things that brought her genuine joy and peace, like spending time in nature, picking up a love for painting she'd dropped in her teens, or simply allowing herself quiet time to rest and recharge without feeling guilty. These acts of self-care were like sending messages to herself that she was worthy of care, that her needs mattered, a direct counter to the neglect she'd learned to expect. The toughest but most important part of this phase was actively challenging her negative core beliefs. Beliefs like, "I am unlovable," "I will always be abandoned," "I'm not good enough," were stuck deep in her mind. Her therapist helped her spot these beliefs when they popped up in her daily life and then systematically take them apart. She learned to ask for evidence. Where was the absolute proof that she was unlovable? Could there be other ways to look at past events? She began to reframe her thoughts, consciously replacing the old damaging stories with kinder, more realistic ones. For example, instead of "he left because I'm not good enough," she could explore, "the relationship ended for many reasons, some of which had nothing to do with my worth." This wasn't about denying reality, but about developing a more balanced view. She started using affirmations not as magic spells, but as deliberate practice to retrain her brain. "I deserve love and belonging. I am capable and resilient. I am safe within myself." This period also involved facing the withdrawal and internalizing stages of abandonment recovery. There was a longing for what was lost, sadness, and that tendency to blame herself. By recognizing these as stages, she could get through them with more understanding. She learned that these feelings weren't proof she was defective, but a natural part of grieving what past abandonments had cost her. The transformation wasn't a smooth, straight line up. There were setbacks, days when old anxieties flared, when the urge to fall back into self-sabotaging habits was strong. There were moments of rage and protest, where the unfairness of her past experiences felt overwhelming. But now she had tools. She had her therapist and her small but growing support network. She had her developing practice of self-compassion. Each time she got through a setback without completely falling apart, her resilience grew. She was moving from feeling cursed by her past to actively working with it, learning from it, and slowly, steadily building a new internal world based on self-acceptance and strength. The challenge continued, but now it was a challenge she was meeting with her own agency and a growing sense of her own power. After months, even years, of dedicated, often exhausting inner work, Elara started to feel a major shift. It wasn't like a sudden bolt of lightning, but more like a slow, steady sunrise after a long, dark night. The curse hadn't totally disappeared. Its whispers might always be a faint echo, but its power over her was definitely fading. This was her resurrection, the arrival of a solution that didn't come from outside, but that she'd built from within. She was starting to reclaim herself. One of the most noticeable rewards was a new sense of inner peace. That constant, nagging anxiety that had been with her whole life started to quiet down. There were still moments of worry, sure, but they didn't take over anymore. She could feel them, acknowledge them, and then let them pass without getting swept away. This inner stability was a revelation. She discovered she could feel safe within herself, a feeling she once thought was impossible. Her relationships began to change. With her newfound self-awareness and healthier ways of coping, she started to approach connections differently. That desperate need for constant reassurance faded. She found she could communicate her needs and boundaries more clearly and calmly, without that underlying panic that someone would reject her. This was key in building healthier relationships. She started to attract and build connections that felt balanced and supportive, instead of just replaying old patterns of chasing and being abandoned. Trust, which once felt like a foreign idea, started to grow, cautiously at first, then with more confidence. She learned to tell the difference between a real threat to her relationship and an old fear making her misread things. Her self-esteem, once so fragile and dependent on what others thought, began to get stronger. She started to recognize her own worth, not because someone else told her she was worthy, but because she had done the hard work of healing and knew her own strength and resilience. This carried over into her work life too. She felt more confident in her abilities, less driven by the fear of not being good enough, and more motivated by real passion and purpose. A big part of her resurrection was moving into what Susan Anderson calls the lifting stage of abandonment recovery. The anger and grief, while still there to be acknowledged, no longer defined her. Instead, a sense of hope and confidence started to bloom. She found meaning in her journey, realizing that the very wounds that had once seemed like a curse had also pushed her toward incredible growth. She felt lighter, like a heavy cloak she'd been carrying for years had finally slipped off her shoulders. She started to see real changes in how she acted. Where she once might have sabotaged a new relationship out of fear, she now approached it with cautious optimism. Where she once would have fallen apart if someone criticized her, she could now consider it, learn from it if it was valid, or let it go if it wasn't, without it crushing her sense of self. She was no longer just defined by the trauma of abandonment. She was becoming defined by her journey of overcoming it. This wasn't about becoming some perfect, fearless person. It was about becoming whole, integrated. She accepted that the scars of her past were part of her story, but they were no longer the whole story. The solution that emerged was a quiet strength, a resilient spirit, and a capacity for joy and connection that she had once believed were lost to her forever. She was clearly healing, building a life not on the ashes of despair, but on the solid foundation of her reclaimed power. Elara's journey didn't just stop with those initial breakthroughs. It flowed into a new way of living, an empowered life that showed just how much she had transformed. The road back was about weaving her healing into the everyday stuff of life, consciously living from her new strength instead of her old wounds. Her after wasn't a life free of challenges, but a life where she faced those challenges with a toughness and self-belief she simply didn't have before. The biggest difference from her before was the quality of her relationships. She now built connections based on mutual respect, honesty, and a healthy kind of give and take. She was no longer terrified of intimacy, nor did she dive into it with that desperate intensity. She could be vulnerable without losing herself, and she could offer support without overdoing it or expecting to be some kind of savior. Friendships became deeper, becoming real sources of joy and comfort rather than minefields of potential rejection. Romantic relationships, when they happened, were approached with an open heart, but also with a clear sense of her own worth and her boundaries. That old fear of abandonment still popped up sometimes, like a faint echo from the past, but now she had the tools to soothe that fear from within, instead of projecting it onto her partner. Her relationship with herself was maybe the most deeply changed. That inner critic, though not totally gone, was no longer the main voice in her head. It had mostly been replaced by a voice of self-kindness and encouragement. She treated herself gently, forgiving her mistakes and celebrating her wins, no matter how small. This internal shift shone outward, affecting how she carried herself, how she spoke, and the kind of energy she brought into a room. There was a quiet confidence about her, an authenticity that naturally drew people to her. Professionally, Elara found a new sense of purpose. No longer driven by the need to prove she was good enough or to avoid being cast aside, she went after work that truly matched her values and passions. She took risks she would have run from before, trusting that she could handle any setbacks. Her creativity, once choked by fear and self-doubt, started to blossom. So, what did her empowered life look like? It looked like waking up most mornings feeling calm and looking forward to the day, instead of with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. It looked like enjoying her own company, finding peace and happiness in being alone without it making her feel lonely or desolate. It looked like setting healthy boundaries without feeling guilty, saying no when she needed to, and making her own well-being a priority. It looked like laughing more freely, engaging more deeply with people and experiences, and feeling a richness in her daily life that had been missing for so long. She had rebuilt her life, not by trying to erase the past, but by learning its lessons. The ashes of her despair had truly become fertile ground for new growth. She understood that her healing journey was ongoing, a continuous practice of self-awareness and self-care. But the curse had been broken. She was no longer a victim of her past, but the empowered designer of her present and future. She carried her scars not as marks of shame, but as symbols of her resilience, of the incredible journey she'd taken from feeling broken and abandoned to a place of wholeness and self-ownership. Her life was proof that even the deepest wounds can heal, and that true empowerment comes from within. She had moved from a life run by fear to one guided by love, first and foremost, love for herself. Elara's transformation wasn't a journey she kept hidden away. The elixir she brought back was the hard-earned wisdom from her experience, the deep understanding that healing truly is possible, and the quiet power of her own story. Her purpose shifted from just surviving her own pain to gently lighting the way for others who might be struggling in similar shadows. Her message wasn't shouted from a mountaintop, but shared in quiet talks, through her actions, and eventually, through more deliberate efforts to support others. She learned that her vulnerability, once her biggest fear, was now her greatest strength. By sharing her story, honestly and without frills, she offered a ray of hope. She showed that it was possible to go from feeling fundamentally flawed and cursed by abandonment to a place of deep self-acceptance and empowerment. The heart of her takeaway for others had a few key parts. First, validating the pain. She stressed that the agony of abandonment is real and deep. It's not something to be downplayed or brushed off. Acknowledging the wound is the first vital step towards healing. Second, the power of self-compassion. Elara often shared how learning to treat herself with the kindness she'd always looked for from others was a huge turning point. It's about becoming your own best friend on the healing journey. Third, she emphasized how important it is to seek support. While the journey is deeply personal, it doesn't have to be a lonely one. Whether it's through therapy, support groups, or trusted friends, connection is a powerful remedy for the isolation that abandonment creates. She often talked about how her therapist acted as a guide, helping her find her way through the tricky landscape of her inner world. Fourth, Elara's story highlighted the message of resilience. We humans have an incredible ability to heal and grow, even from the most painful experiences. The scars might remain, but they don't have to control the future. She was living proof that healing isn't about erasing the past, but about weaving it into a larger, more empowered story. It's about understanding that tough times can, strangely enough, lead to profound strength and wisdom. Her journey made the experience of healing feel universal. While the details of her abandonment were her own, the underlying themes of loss, grief, self-doubt, and the longing for connection are things we all understand. Her transformation offered a real-life example that even if you feel broken beyond repair, there is a path to wholeness. It's not a quick or easy path, but it is a possible one. She encouraged others to be patient with their own healing, to understand that there will be setbacks, and that these aren't signs of failure, but just part of the journey. Her life became a quiet testament to the idea that you can move from being a victim of your circumstances to being the empowered author of your own life. The elixir she brought back wasn't some magic potion, but the inspiring truth of her own lived experience. That from the deepest despair, a powerful, resilient, and joyful life can be rebuilt. Her story reminds us that healing from trauma is about finding ways to thrive in spite of it, turning pain into purpose. If Elara's journey speaks to you, if you felt the sting of abandonment or the weight of a past that seems to be running your present, please know you're not alone. Share this story with someone who might need to hear it, and if you're struggling, think about taking that first brave step on your own healing journey. Reach out, look for support, because transformation is possible for you too. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience and empowerment. Elara's transformation from feeling cursed and broken to standing tall in her own power is an incredible testament to the human spirit's ability to heal and grow. It reminds us that our deepest wounds don't have to be life sentences, but can actually become the fertile ground from which our greatest strengths emerge. May her story inspire hope and courage in everyone who wants to rewrite their own narrative.